Welcome to today's webinar on tying your roadmap strategy to agile planning. My name is Andre Toys and I will be your moderator today. Our main speaker today will be Jim Semick. Jim is one of the founders of Product Plan. Over the course of the last 15 years, Jim has validated and launched several new products, including AppFolio, GoToMyPC, and GoToMeeting. Jim is also a frequent speaker and writer on product management and entrepreneurship, as well as certified in Scrum methodologies. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much, Andre. It's great to be here.
We chose today's webinar topic because we are often asked by some of our users how to best go about linking the long-term product strategy with agile backlogs. And when we send out today's webinar invitation, we got several hundred registrations, and all of you submitted well over 100 questions ahead of this webinar. A big validation, in my opinion, that this is a hot topic and a challenge for a lot of organizations. Thank you so much for submitting so many questions. We read through all the questions and I noticed the 5 following themes. There were a lot of questions around the level of detail. What's the level of detail for roadmaps and what's the level or the right level of details for the backlog? A lot of questions were around metrics. What are some metrics that help me to prioritize my roadmap? Or what are some metrics that I should take in consideration for my backlog? Another cluster of questions were on planning timelines and methods. How far should I plan out, or should I even use dates to begin with? There were a lot of questions regarding to ways to better communicate your roadmap and to provide transparency throughout the organization. And of course, last but not least, tools. What are some good tools in order to create my roadmap, to build my roadmap, or what are some tools for my backlog? So those were the 5 themes that we really saw a lot in the questions. So before I hand it over to Jim, I'm curious to see what's our audience today. If everybody could submit the poll right now and let us know if you're in product management or in project management, or you're part of a marketing team, are you in executive, or perhaps in another team. Okay, lots of polls are coming in. Let me share the results. Interesting, okay. I guess not all that surprising. A lot of you out there that are attending the webinar right now are in product or project management.
That's great. Well, it shows that we're speaking to the right audience. I'm really happy to be here today and talk about a topic that comes up so often with our customer base. We talk every day with our customers about roadmap process, roadmap prioritization, and there is often the question of how do I tie that back to the backlog? How do I tie it back to my organization that might be agile or moving to agile? And so this is something that I want to talk about today in terms of prioritization and how you tie back to the strategy of what the company is trying to accomplish. As Andre mentioned, we had well over 100 questions related to this topic. So that really shows you the fire that's out there for this topic. But I want to kick things off first by talking about the difference between strategy and execution, the differences between the roadmap and the backlog. So we can just kind of level set with what we're talking about. So to start, the roadmap is a strategic communication document. It's a way of talking with your stakeholders about what it is that you are going to be building or what you might want to build. And it's something that you use to have a conversation. It's something you use to do scenario planning. It's something you use to talk with different stakeholder departments, such as marketing or engineering, about what you want to accomplish. So by its nature, the roadmap is really big initiatives. It's big themes that you want to accomplish, or epics. So it's really not at that granular level. And on the other hand, the backlog is what you already know. It's thinking in themes of thinking in terms of tasks or specific stories that you want to accomplish. So by its very nature, it's very granular and detailed. But let me go into a little more detail about the roadmap versus the backlog. So as I mentioned, the roadmap is the big picture, those big initiatives that you have planned. And the backlog is very, very detailed. So for every initiative on your roadmap, you might have potentially dozens of items represented in the backlog. Now, the roadmap, because it's executive facing or stakeholder facing or planning and product team facing, that typically is over the long term. So with our customer base, the average roadmap duration is about a year. So they show what's going to happen over the period of a year. Now, of course, every company is different, both in terms of the product that they produce and the life cycle of the company. So for some organizations, such as maybe early stage startups, the horizon tends to be shorter. Things are moving very quickly. The roadmap is in flux, or those future initiatives are fuzzy. So that tends to be shorter term. Larger organizations that have more structure, they have a more robust portfolio, and maybe the life cycle of those products is a little bit longer, might even have a longer term horizon on the roadmap. So for example, up to 3 years. Now the backlog though is different. The backlog has a shorter term horizon. So if you are operating in an agile environment, for example, you're using Scrum methodology, you might be planning out only the next few sprints, when sprints can be 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and so on. So it really is a very short-term horizon. And you really don't want to be planning out too much further, because the whole point of Agile is that you're able to prioritize and order that backlog on the fly as circumstances change. So let's talk a little bit about dates. This is another question that comes up so often about roadmaps. So often the roadmap will have rough dates. And what I mean by rough dates are at a very high level, meaning you talk in terms of months or quarters. And there is definitely a movement, and we're seeing this in product management in general, a movement towards no dates on the roadmap. And the purpose of that is, one, we're tending to operate more and more in agile environments where you don't want to commit to specific dates, and you don't want to set expectations, inappropriate expectations with your stakeholders, but also you don't want to communicate something to your stakeholders and then be held accountable for that in an environment where the roadmap is agile and changing. So the backlog, however, often has dates. Now, it really does depend. The dates on the backlog depend on what sort of agile methodology you're using. So for example, if you're using Kanban, you may not have dates. Kanban is a method where you're simply ordering your backlog and the things that you're committing to for the current development cycle, and then those are processed in order. And there may or may not be dates associated with those. If you're using sprints, however, definitely you want to have dates associated with that, because if you're on a 2-week sprint cycle, then that sprint date is well known, and the team is committing to a certain amount of work within that time frame. So it's a little bit of differences between the roadmap and the backlog in terms of dates. Now, the focus of the roadmap is very different versus the backlog. The roadmap is a communication tool. The roadmap, the purpose of it is to get all of your stakeholders on the same page with what you're going to be doing, having that discussion around what it is that you want to accomplish, those trade-offs discussions that have to happen, the prioritization discussions, the discussions around strategy and how the roadmap initiatives tie back to strategy. So it's really about communication. The backlog, however, is about execution. You know what you're going to accomplish through the roadmap, and the backlog is about how you're going to execute that strategy. Now, the roadmap tends to be prioritized less often. Now, I think the days of creating a one-year roadmap, and then this is what we're going to accomplish in 2017, I think those days are growing numbered. We're seeing fewer and fewer organizations that produce this one artifact, and the entire team and the entire company is held accountable to that one artifact that, at the end of the year may or may not happen. So the roadmaps are tending to be more and more agile, and so you are prioritizing it more often than a year. You're definitely, what we're seeing from our customers is that they're reprioritizing and reorganizing their roadmaps much more frequently than they used to, much more than a quarter or even a month. Now, the backlog, by its very nature, is prioritized very frequently, even within a sprint. So, for example, if you have a 2-week sprint, even within that sprint, you're often reordering what's happening and you're reprioritizing. But as you move towards the next sprint, the the product owner or the product manager should be reprioritizing that backlog in light of the things that are changing within the organization. Now, on the roadmap side, the estimates are very high level. So we did receive a few questions around estimation, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But the estimation for the roadmap is often at the t-shirt size. So is this thing that we're considering small, medium, or large, or extra large? Now, the backlog, of course, has much more granular estimates. So for every item you have on the roadmap, you may have dozens of stories and tasks that are associated with it in the backlog. And so by that nature, the estimates need to be more granular. So, a lot of you, I think, are using story points, for example. So you're using maybe the Fibonacci scale to assign story points to the relative effort level for every item in the backlog. So those estimates tend to be much more granular. Now, because the focus of the roadmap versus the backlog is very different, people tend to use different tools. So tools that are focused on communication, such as PowerPoint, or product roadmap software like ours, Product Plan. Those tend to be appropriate to use for communicating with your stakeholders. Now, the backlog, because it is short-term, it's execution-focused, tends to have project management tools associated with it. So tools like Atlassian's Jira, or Pivotal Tracker, or even spreadsheets, or Trello. Products like that tend to be used more for the backlog. Okay, and as Andre mentioned, I do want to make sure that we're gonna save time at the end for some of the questions. I think we received well over 100 questions even before the webinar started, and so we'll make sure to address some of those. But definitely send us your questions during the webinar today, and we'll make sure and address some of those near the end. So we'll make sure and save time for that. Now, let's talk a little bit about prioritization. I mentioned I was going to be touching on that, and that's really what the focus of the webinar is today. We're going to talk about very specific techniques that you can use for prioritization, but I do want to talk a little bit at the big picture level about the differences in roadmaps versus the backlog. So with the roadmap, the prioritization is about strategy typically. So with the roadmap, you really don't know the specifics. Some of these initiatives you're putting on the roadmap are fuzzy, especially these items that you're planning out multiple quarters. You have an idea of what you want to accomplish, but you don't know the specifics yet. You may not know how big this thing is going to be, and you certainly don't know yet how many resources you're going to be assigning that particular initiative. And so the roadmap is about strategic goals. It's about trying to prioritize based on all of the factors that we as product managers prioritize based on. We prioritize based on things like customer value or customer delight, competitive differentiation, and what's happening in your market, the development effort, and again, that's often at a very high level. Things like internal metrics such as support cost and things like that come into play. Risk comes into play, business goals, and then of course there are the inevitable stakeholder needs, the project that the CEO really wants to make happen, or a particular stakeholder that is pushing really hard for something, or sales might be talking very loudly about something that is going to move the needle for them. So all of these things are taken into account when you're prioritizing the roadmap. But the backlog is different. The backlog is representing what you're already agreeing to on the roadmap. So you know more about, it's more about prioritizing based on the effort level and less about business, business needs such as stakeholder needs and so on. So you're prioritizing based on the customer value, certainly, but you're basing it based on things that are associated with project management, story points, the resources that you have available, whether you have a particular team that's available that specializes in a certain thing. So the roadmap is about prioritizing the big picture and strategic goals, and the backlog is representing those things that are already known. The only thing that you don't know in the backlog is the development order, and that's where the prioritization comes into play on the backlog. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, good. So we're going to have another poll here.
Great, thank you, Jim. I'm really interested in this one. We have several hundred people online right now. So I would love to know, what are your roadmap prioritization challenges right now? Are you only prioritizing details and really are missing the big picture? Or are priorities driven in your organization just by the executive team and not the customer? Are priorities mainly determined by sales prospects, or even worse, the very last conversation that a sales guy had? Or is there too much subjectivity in your prioritization process? Or are your priorities unclear and ever changing? So I'm curious to hear this one. Let's give it a few more seconds so everybody, or a lot of people, had a chance to give your vote in. I'm seeing the votes come in. So it looks like we're getting close to having a good number of everybody who's online right now submitting their vote. I will be closing the poll very soon. All right, let me share the results. Okay, it looks a fairly even spread, but it looks like the priorities are unclear or ever changing is the one that won this result. Very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. Those are really interesting results. And I've heard this before from customers and other product managers, where the priorities are not customer driven. They're driven internally by executives. And so this does not surprise me that that's one of the biggest challenges. And then too much subjectivity in the prioritization process. We're definitely going to be talking about that today. Different techniques that you can use to reduce some of that subjectivity. We'll talk about the pros and cons of that as well. So great. So let's talk first about strategies for prioritizing the roadmap. And I'm going to be breaking this up into two different sections today. One is strategies for prioritizing the roadmap, and then the other section is strategies you can use for prioritizing the backlog. Okay. So one of the first methods is something that is very common in product management. It's a way of thinking in product management about prioritizing the roadmap. And whether or not you formalize this in some sort of document or a formal discussion, this is really the matrix that is going on in most product managers' heads when you're trying to decide whether to prioritize something. And it's this concept of value versus effort. And there are different ways of talking about it. Some people talk about the customer delight versus development effort. Some people talk about value versus cost. But the matrix is really the same. And it works like this, that you want to prioritize items that are high customer value, high business value, against you want to prioritize those high value items that are low cost to implement. Okay, so that tends to be the low-hanging fruit on the roadmap. And this is, and I'm going to talk about a way of making this a more formal process next through scoring. But right here is a way that you can talk about these initiatives with your stakeholders. You can help them understand the trade-off decisions that you're making with some of these items. So the way this works is that you want to plot items in the upper left quadrant that have high value and are low cost. Now the items in the lower right quadrant that are low value and high cost or high effort, these are items that you will probably never get to. So then some interesting discussions happen around the other quadrants. So which items do you have that have a high cost to them but also have a commensurate high customer value? So these are items for discussion, and certainly you want to include some of those items. In this example here, it's item number F, or item letter F, and item A. You want to include those items on your roadmap. And then probably less so, you want to pepper in a few items that have lower customer value but have low effort to implement. So this is the discussion that you can have with stakeholders. And whether or not you have formalized this, you probably are already going through this decision process today. So a way of formalizing it is through a weighted scoring model. And you essentially look at the same criteria, this benefit versus cost, or value versus effort. And you formalize it through a scoring model. And product managers will often use a spreadsheet to go through this process. Now, Product Plan has a built-in scoring model that you can use to prioritize, and it's actually customizable based on your organization's criteria for evaluating opportunities. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in the webinar. But the way that this works is that you assign a value to every one of these items. So if an item has high benefit, you might score it on a 1 through 5 basis, for example. 1 meaning low benefit and a 5 meaning high benefit. And then you have an offsetting cost. 1 meaning low cost and 5 meaning high cost. And then you have that sort of discussion with your stakeholders on this criteria and this scoring. And at the end of the day, I want to make this point, that the score itself doesn't really matter. You don't want to be prioritizing based solely on a score like this, because the score is subjective, right? What is a 5? What is a 3? And so what you want to be doing is using this as a tool and a framework for having a discussion with your stakeholders. So that, in my opinion, is the most important thing, that you're having a discussion, and whether or not something turns out to be a score of 70 versus a 68, that doesn't really matter. It's really the discussion that you have. And then on top of that, you need to bring in your good product management instincts into the discussion that is not necessarily represented by a score. So competitive differentiation or customer delight or things like that are really hard to capture within a score. So you still want to use your instincts, your knowledge about your personas and about your buyers and about your market. You want to bring that into the mix as well. Okay, another way of prioritizing the roadmap is the Cano model. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a way of prioritizing features and future initiatives based on how much customer delight it delivers, and then also about what type of feature it is and how much investment you want to make in that feature. So let's start by this. Let's start by talking about these basic threshold features. So I used to work for a B2B SaaS company, and we produced accounting software for a particular market. And in order to be competitive, we needed to have an accounts payable module. Now, accounts payable is one of those things that you simply have to have. If we didn't have accounts payables features, then we wouldn't be competitive. People simply wouldn't look at our solution. However, those aren't the features that move the needle. Once you have accounts payable and a basic set of functionality, you don't necessarily need to continue investing in that feature in order to remain competitive. And so that's what the Cano model says, is that these basic threshold features that your product has to have in order to remain competitive have a diminishing return as you can continue to invest in them. So that's what this means here. If you don't have it, you're having very low customer delight, right? People won't even use the system because it simply doesn't have this core functionality. But as you invest over time in these basic threshold features, they have diminishing return. So you really don't want to put so much effort on improving these features. You don't want to put a lot of additional effort into enhancing accounts payable. Now, there are some features that give you a linear return, and these features we call performance features. So as you invest in performance in your product or your app, you're going to get a commensurate return in customer delight. So as you continue to make things faster and better in your system, then your customers are going to continue to like you more, and you'll receive more customer delight. Now, finally, there are these excitement features. And excitement features sometimes aren't the features that customers are asking for. Customers may not even know that these features are possible. They may not know that they exist. And so what you want to do is find these potential features and invest in some of those features, and that gives you a disproportionate return in customer delight. So, for example, with the software I was describing earlier for the B2B SaaS company, we made investments in certain features that our competitors didn't have. And these were features that mattered to our market. features that help them bring more business in. And when we introduce these features, which, to be honest, sometimes weren't as hard as some of those core underlying features, they didn't require as much development effort, it delivered us an amazing amount of customer delight. And so what you want to do is pour investment into those excitement features. Okay? But what you don't want to do is pour investment into excitement features at the expense of performance and having those basic features in the product. Okay, so let's do another poll here. Andre?
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. So this next question is around some Agile challenges. Actually, that question was incorrect. Question on the slide. So I'm curious to find out what type of Agile methods do you currently practice, or if you actually practice Agile or not. So first option here is Scrum, next one is XP, then Kanban, or perhaps there are some other Agile methodologies that you currently practice, or if you aren't practice Agile quite yet, then select the last option. I'm giving this a few more seconds, so more votes are coming in.
Okay, fantastic. So it looks like the results are primarily Scrum. That's great. So I can talk quite a bit about Scrum because I've used Scrum in several organizations, and Product Plan, in fact, uses Scrum for development. So I'm well versed in that and have read and taken a number of Scrum courses. So I'm glad we can talk about that. All right, so let's talk about prioritizing the backlog. So as I mentioned, we're breaking up this talk into two separate sections. One is the roadmap, and then the other part is executing on the roadmap. So just to level set about Agile, so a lot of you are using Scrum, so you already understand this concept. But for those that aren't, I just want to make sure that you understand the idea of iterative development. So it's not simply building small pieces and then releasing the whole feature or the whole product. It really is about, through different releases, kind of sketching out the complete picture. So your first release may be feature complete, but it may not have everything and feature-wise within the product. And so through successive sprints or releases, you'll be delivering the full blown feature that is that your customers are asking for. So, but I do want to make this point here that these other methods that I've talked about, whether it's Kanban or rather the Kano model or a subjective scoring model or objective scoring model, all of those methods will work for prioritizing the backlog. But I'm going to talk about three other methods that you can use. The first one is story mapping. And this is a way of planning out different releases. So story mapping works this way, that you across the top, and you can use actual cards or post-it notes to do this, and there's also software that you can use for story mapping. You want to create the user's flow through your system. And you go from left to right. So for example, you want to, in this example here, user management is the first thing. So users need to register, and then they need to log in, and then they need to update their preferences. And then in the next section, they want to book a room, for example. So they need to search for a room, view room information, and so on. So you take the user's trip and cycle and experience through your software, and you lay that out into almost like a column format. And this way of thinking is particularly good for new major features that you have or brand new products. So I've used this method on several occasions to map out the MVP for new products. And then what you do is within every column, you list out every one of the major features or epics that you have. So for example, on the first column there, you want to create a new user. Okay, and then you prioritize those things in must-have order. So, for example, I wouldn't be able to have a system if a user couldn't create a new user in the system. They couldn't register for an account. And so what you do is you then prioritize within these columns, and then you can almost in an arbitrary sense take tape and lay out releases, right? So your first release is this minimum functionality in order for the system to have some level of customer value, okay? And then you do successive releases that way. So that's just one method, and there are some fantastic resources on this. I know that Jeff Patton has a book around story mapping, so there are some really great resources for you around story mapping. Another method is Moscow analysis, and it's prioritizing the backlog based on must-haves, should-haves, could-haves, and won't have, but you would like to have it in the future. So you can use Moscow analysis in conjunction with story mapping and other prioritization methods in order to have a discussion with your team about what order the backlog should be in. And another method is by using release themes. So a lot of companies, for a particular sprint or development cycle, they will group and order stories together based on a theme. And a theme is often at a higher level than an epic. And a theme is a way of thinking about, often from a customer's perspective, what you're going to be delivering. So for example, you might have a theme that says, we're going to increase shopping cart completion. And then you pull in stories into the sprint or the backlog for increasing shopping cart completion. And then you might, within that, prioritize those. And of course, you would need your engineering team to help you determine the order within the sprint that you develop. And with Scrum, that's often up to the engineering team to decide in what order they want to develop that in. But then you're grouping these things together by theme. So it's a nice way of creating a theme for a particular release. All right, so now we have another question about tools for the backlog. So let's talk about that.
Great, thank you, Jim. Just a quick reminder, we have gotten a few questions in. Thank you for everybody to submit the questions. Obviously, the advantage of attending a live webinar is that you have the chance to submit all the questions. So please submit all the questions you have, and we will pick a few at the end of the webinar. But this is the last poll. So the question here is, what tools do you use to manage the backlog? There were a lot of questions in the beginning of or when we send out the invitation for the webinar, what tools can we recommend? And before Jim is doing a demo, I'm curious to just ask everybody to use spreadsheets or whiteboards or other agile tools. So please take a moment and submit your votes. Looks like we have a lot of votes that are coming in. Let me close this and share the results with you. Awesome. Looks like a lot of you are software guys and tool guys out there. Looks like a lot of you are using Jira, or Pivotal, or Akinote, and perhaps some other agile tools. That's fantastic. Great to see.
Yeah, if we had more time, I'd like to do another poll to find out which agile tools they're using. In our customer base, Jira tends to be one of the more popular products out there, but we do have customers using Pivotal Tracker, Team Foundation Server, and others. So that's really interesting to me. All right, so what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about tying the roadmap and the backlog together. And we received a number of questions around this. So what I'm going to do is just for a couple of minutes here talk about a way of thinking about the roadmap versus the backlog. So you have your product roadmap here. And in this example here, we have a product roadmap where we have a number of initiatives on the roadmap for the year. And you can see that this product roadmap is at the quarter level, right? So there are no specific dates here saying we're going to deliver this particular product or this particular feature on a specific date. So that's one of the differences between the backlog and the roadmap, is that you're not promising stakeholders very specific dates. So in this example here, we have what we call in product plan these bars, and the bars represent major initiatives that you have. For example, the new admin console. And we also have a concept of containers. So in this example here, we have third-party integrations. And within third-party integrations, we have several different integrations that we're working on. So you can see that we're grouping these together. So this third-party integrations might represent a theme that you have. And within that, we have Slack integration, for example. And Slack integration may be an entire epic, because it would span multiple sprints in order to get Slack integration working, for example. Now, within product plan, you have details within every one of these items. So for this new admin console, we have some information about its strategic importance. We have some custom tags that have been added. We have some comments from the team and discussion happening. We also have an indication of what percentage complete this is, how it ties back to the strategic goals that you have. And then we also have this linked to Jira. So let's see here. So within Product Plan, you can actually search for Jira issues and Jira epics. And we're going to connect to this new admin console epic that's already in Jira. And then you can click out to Jira and look at all of the issues and stories and tasks and bugs that are contained with it. So in this way, we are connecting the big picture on the roadmap to the details within the backlog and what's happening within the sprint. Now, with Product Plan does have an integration with Jira, and through that, you can send information from Jira into Product Plan as this particular epic changes. So for example, as this epic is completed, as the stories within the epic are completed, the percentage complete within Product Plan will automatically update. So here you're tying together the big picture of what's happening from a project management perspective, and you're delivering it in a way that the executives and stakeholders would understand. Okay, great. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the demonstration, and of course you can always contact us, and we're happy to tell you more about Product Plan and how the Jira integration works, and we also, of course, have a free trial of that. But now we'd like to open this up for questions, and so Andre, do you want to start firing off some questions?
Awesome, thank you, Jim. We've got a number of questions come in. Thank you so much for everybody who submitted questions during the webinar, and please keep them coming. We're going to spend about 10 minutes or so on questions, so please use the questions panel and go to webinar and submit your questions. The first question that came in is from Ben, and Ben's question is, do you have a different roadmap for internal and external audiences?
That's a great question. That's one that we get fairly often at Product Plan. A lot of our customers have an internal version of the roadmap, and then an external customer-facing or vendor-facing version of the roadmap. And then they have different versions of the roadmap for different stakeholders. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So some of our customers, for example, gov.uk is a customer of Product Plan, and they actually have a public-facing roadmap. Now, there may be some information that they keep inside gov.uk that they don't want exposed to the public, but the majority of the roadmap is transparent and public. Some of our customers actually create a special customer-facing roadmap, so they may tag their roadmap initiatives with internal or external tags, and then you can create a custom version of the roadmap just for your external stakeholders, such as a vendor, for example. The other thing that product managers tend to do is have different roadmaps for different internal stakeholders. For example, sales is a great example of that. In sales, you don't want to do certain things. You don't want to, one, expose specific delivery dates. You don't want to set expectations that then sales provides to a prospective customer. And then when the roadmap shifts, which they inevitably will shift, then the customer's expectations aren't met. Okay, so that's one way that the sales roadmap might be different than your internal product roadmap. Another way is with the duration of the roadmap. So you may want to constrain the roadmap that you present to the sales team and show maybe only the next couple of quarters versus the entire year. And so with Product Plan, it's very easy to do. You can on the fly change the duration of the roadmap, and then those things that go beyond that end date are just simply hidden from view. So that's another way of changing it up. A lot of our customers actually take off dates when presenting to sales. They simply present a roadmap that has no dates on it, so that sales gets an idea of when, or what the priorities are, but they don't understand when those are going to happen. So they can't set, unmet dates with potential customers. So that's one way that they create different roadmaps. And you might do the same thing for marketing, you might do the same thing for customer success, and so on, these internal stakeholders that really need to know what's happening. Okay, next question, Andre.
Great, there was another question come in, but I think you pretty much answered it already. How would you recommend combining roadmaps from several stakeholders in the company? For example, marketing or product or tech teams have different roadmaps. Perhaps you want to do a follow-up real quick on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's an important topic because the product roadmap and what's happening on the product and engineering side is not the only thing that's happening. There are all of these dependencies within the organization. Marketing is dependent on what's happening, and customer success and so on. And so it's really important for those internal stakeholders to be aware of the roadmap and what's shifting. And so a lot of our customers, the marketing team, the operations team, and in some cases other teams like finance, for example, are involved. And obviously the IT team and engineering are part of this, especially if they're involved in platform initiatives. So with Product Plan, you can actually merge different roadmaps together into what we call a master plan. And then you can see all of these roadmaps and the different initiatives that are happening within a particular time frame at once. And so, I think that it's really important for a product to understand that there are these other stakeholders that are out there, and that they have their own initiatives and their own roadmaps that are dependent on what's happening on your side of things.
Great, thank you, Jim. The next question is from Alexander. Alexander is asking, in my experience, roadmaps do not include bugs, but some bugs are complex and require big investments. How do you plan for bugs and prioritize bugs versus feature development?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I like that question a lot because that's something that comes up on every single team I've been on, which is, solving a bug in many cases, especially if it has to do with an underlying performance issue or something like that, it's not always customer facing. And so, but the reality is that you need to make investments in those bugs. You need to make investments on technical debt. And these don't always have direct customer payoff. So if you're upgrading to Rails 4, for example, the customers aren't necessarily going to see the fruits of that. At least it won't be evident to them. And so how do you prioritize those? And so, I think it's important from a product standpoint to always have a kind of a mix in any particular sprint of these I guess, internal things and bugs. Now, so a lot of bugs aren't always evident to a big lot of customers, but if you don't resolve the bugs, then you're going to have potential customer dissatisfaction. So from that perspective, it's important to address the bugs. But what you want to do within a sprint is allocate time for these technical debt items, for bugs, for the inevitable fires that come up. And so a lot of teams will actually kind of portion out the sprint based on some buckets that they have. So they might have some customer delight-oriented features, some new features, and a certain percentage of the sprint, a certain percentage of the story points that you have based on the team's velocity will be assigned to those new features. Maybe there are ongoing enhancements. Maybe there are UX initiatives and usability initiatives. And then there's a bucket for bugs and fires and things like that. So you always want to make sure and pepper those in. And for those of you that are using Scrum, which it looks like a lot or most of you are, it's one of the tenets of Scrum and Agile is that you don't have bugs, right? And so you need to be addressing these along the way and not accumulating that debt that will come back to bite you.
Great, thank you. You already addressed another question I was planning on asking you. This came from Craig in regards to prioritizing tech debt. but I think we can skip that. I think you already addressed that. The next question is from Steve. It's a longer question. How do you recommend communicating and showing the small stories that always seem to come up? I hear the comment, there's always room for a 3 to 5 point story, but I don't want to show this level of detail on my epic scale roadmap. The trouble with this is that when we have many of these over the course of a year, they end up impacting our roadmap. How would you show this when your executives don't want the small stories on the high-level roadmap?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, so this relates back to the bugs question and how you track those on the roadmap. And the roadmap, as I talked about before, and it relates to this question as well, which is the roadmap is for the high-level strategy, right? So these are the big initiatives, but that doesn't mean that you don't represent some of these 3 and 5 point stories in some way. You just don't want to have like space allocated towards it on the roadmap. So here's an example of how you could do this. You could create a theme, and the theme could be at a high level, which is these stories that relate to a particular feature or a particular product. And so you can group all of these items together into this theme, and just so your executives know and the stakeholders know that you're going to be allocating a certain amount of time to those items. But what you don't want to be doing, and I want to caution you against that, is showing your stakeholders everything that's in your backlog. All of these 3 and 5 point stories, even though they're important and you want to make sure and address them, you need to be able to communicate the big picture to your executives without having their eyes glaze over. And if you're talking about these smaller items to your executives, they're not seeing the big picture. So what you want to do is roll up all of those stories, if you can, into something on the roadmap. And in product plan, that could be a bar or something like that. Something on the roadmap that's dedicated to those smaller features that maybe that you don't want to let slip through the cracks. And you can keep a list of that somewhere if you want it. My opinion is that the list is the backlog, right? You can tag those within whatever tool you're using to a particular epic. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for all the questions. I know we went over a 45-minute time slot, but there's just so many questions are coming in and so many of you are still online. So thank you for that. Maybe we do a couple more questions and then close it out. The next question is from Rohit. Rohit asks, business environments and realities are often require that dates be placed on a roadmap. And also some engineering teams are inherently deadline driven. How do you suggest reconciling this with the roadmap approaches you outlined, which de-emphasizes scheduling?
Yeah, Rohit, that's a really good question. So I think that a lot of organizations have operated in a dates-driven environment, and so there's really no escaping that reality. And so you need to deal with that on the roadmap. And on the roadmap, you can put in more specific dates. So for example, on a month basis, or product plan actually will allow you to do dates at a more granular level. We also have a milestones feature where you can plug in a specific delivery date. So for example, if you're shooting for a particular feature to be released before a customer conference, that's a very specific delivery date, right? You can't avoid that, and everybody's talking about that date. And so you can represent that on the roadmap, and I think that's fair. But I think a lot of it has to do with how you're talking about the roadmap with your stakeholders and the expectations that you're setting. And so it's really important that your stakeholders understand that the roadmap will change, and that just because you're showing something to be released in March of 2017, different priorities will come into play. And so what you want to do is make sure that along the way you're setting expectations and that there are no surprises. So, a stakeholder may have a particular goal in mind and a particular date in mind. You just don't want to set the expectation or have them shocked when you don't meet that date for whatever reason, for competitive reasons or whatever. So I think a lot of this has to do with communication from the product manager to the different stakeholders. One, explaining that things inevitably will change, and two, talking with them often enough so that there aren't surprises that happen along the way. So I think that, I think that's one way of kind of managing this issue of stakeholders expecting a certain date and product not wanting to promise that, which in my opinion is good product management, right?
Thank you, Jim. Hope that answered the question. There's still hundreds of you online. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Lots of great questions here. Next question is from Nathan. Nathan says, corporate plan processes are traditionally waterfall and setting the budget for the coming year. How would you recommend reconciling that with an agile-based approach delivery? How can we allocate our budget if we really don't know specifically what we need to deliver for the coming year?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think that that's the reality, is that you have constraints. Everyone is resource constrained. But you do know the resources that you have. You do know the teams that you have. So for example, if you have five teams available, and maybe you're Scrum, maybe you're Waterfall, you still know the resources that you have available. Good product management is trying to figure out what based on those resources and what you have available to you, and based on customer value, what do you fit in, what do you prioritize? So I don't think, even in a waterfall environment, you can effectively predict what the roadmap can actually accomplish. Even on a sprint basis, we see this every day, and I've seen this in companies where the team commits to a certain well-known list of stories and tasks and bugs, yet it inevitably will change, and inevitably the date won't be met. So and the velocity changes sprint to sprint. So I think even in the most granular situations, you're still faced with that situation of just not really knowing. And so in a waterfall methodology, how can you possibly know at the end of this? Any roadmap that you come up with is really, in a sense, a work of fiction and is your best guess. So I don't think there's really any effective way of doing that, in my opinion.
Thanks, Jim. Next question is from Victoria, and perhaps a follow-up question from an early answer. You described what a backlog is, but I often see my backlog clogged with many bugs. How can I prioritize them while also ensuring that enough time is paid to building out features in the roadmap?
Yeah, great question. And I've been faced with that many times. And from a product manager's perspective, the thing that gives you the most satisfaction is customer-facing features. Those are the things that we live for. We want to make a difference to our customers and make a great product. So one technique that you can use is through themes. So you, for a particular sprint, can say, okay, so we're going to focus on this particular area of our app for this sprint, and we're going to allocate a certain amount of the sprint towards bugs. Now, I think that everybody kind of has a different flavor of Scrum and a different flavor of Agile. Some people actually estimate bugs. And there's a lot of discussion around that in Agile circles about whether you really want to assign story points to bugs or not. But I think it's important in every sprint to be able to carve out some time for that. And then as close as you can get to having that zero bug attitude and approach within the team, even though I know how hard that is, I think you'll be better off. So I think that carving out a little bit of time, and whether you want to allocate 10% of the sprint or whatever to those bugs, I think that's an effective way of doing it, especially if it's grouped together. So you say, I used the accounts payable example earlier. If you say, okay, we're going to carve out a little bit of time to work on all of these accounts payable bugs that we have. I think that what you want to avoid is debt. You want to avoid this technical debt that you accumulate sprint to sprint, because that inevitably will bite you at some point.
All right, thank you, Jim. So maybe the next question is our last question in order to close the webinar at the top of the hour. The last question comes from Jörg. Jörg says, How do you reason in a discussion with waterfall guys for agile roadmap planning? Mine usually come with Team X needs to know when something is going to be shipped to be prepared for that, to communicate to customers. So how do you help your given argument? Why is agile, or how to communicate agile to guys that are traditionally waterfall guys?
Yeah, that's a good one, and that's a little bit tough. So I showed at the beginning the Mona Lisa picture, and I think that's a good approach to work with the waterfall guys, because with waterfall you're creating your PRD, and the PRD is the final product. But as I said before, I think that in most cases, you know, you're making your best guesses, and at the end of the day, it's still a work of fiction. You're really not going to hit that. And so what you want to do is work with the waterfall team and say, we have a certain amount of resources, and we're going to be spending a certain amount of time on this particular feature, but we're going to take it iteratively. And you and they may not exactly know where you're going to draw the line for release 1, release 2, release 3. And unfortunately, that's just something they need to deal with in Agile. This is one of the downsides, is that not everything can be known with Agile. And so that's the expectation, the conversation that you need to have with them. Now, there are probably some features and some things that they and you must have in release 1. So maybe those are the areas where there is no discussion. You simply agree, we will have this. But there are all of these unknowns that will come up even during the sprint that you didn't think about or they didn't think about, and that has to be done and prioritized. And so I think that just getting them in the mindset of, you know what, this whole thing will be accomplished, right? At some point, we will release this whole thing, but we're going to take it successively in iterations. And so I think that's a good way to have a conversation with them.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you so much for your very active participation. We got lots and lots of questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all of them. We tried to pick a good cross-section of different questions. If your question was not answered, I would encourage you to reach out to us and start a conversation with us. And when you leave this webinar, we will ask you to fill out an exit survey. I would greatly appreciate if we get feedback from you in order for us to get better. And there's a question for you to submit a future topic. We read all those surveys and we pick out topics based on all the submissions that we receive. So please fill out the exit survey. And then in addition, I would encourage everybody to go to productplan.com/book in order to download our free book on roadmaps. And we publish usually 2 blog posts every week on our blog. And if you go to productplan.com/blog, you can stay updated on what's going on in product management. You can subscribe to our blog and then get an email from us when we publish new blog posts. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. And I know a lot of you tried Product Plan in the past. So if you're interested and your trial expired to extend your trial, please reach out to us at support@productplan.com and ask for an extension, and we're very happy to extend your trial. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, everyone. It was a lot of fun.